Abigail Boone climbed down from that wagon with her one battered suitcase clutched to her chest and the sound of her father's laughter still ringing in both ears. He had actually laughed. Standing right there on the porch of the family home, she'd spent 26 years trying to make herself small enough to deserve her own father, had laughed when he told her she was the one being sent to Whitaker Ridge. Not Charlotte, her. And then he'd said the words she would carry in her chest like a brand for the rest of her life. Might as well get some use out of you. If you've ever been told by someone who was supposed to love you that you were less than that, you were a burden, a joke, an afterthought, then stay with me. Because this story belongs to every woman who was thrown away and survived it. Subscribe to this channel, follow along to the very end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Abigail Boone left her family's property for the last time, she did not cry. She had used up every tear she had the night before alone in her room with her back pressed flat against the door so nobody could walk in without warning, which was the only kind of privacy she had ever managed to carve out for herself in that house. She'd cried until her throat felt scraped raw, and her face was so swollen she barely recognized herself in the small mirror above the washstand. And then she'd stopped. She'd washed her face with the coldest water she could find. She'd folded her two good dresses with the same care she'd always given to things nobody else in that family ever bothered to notice. She'd packed her mother's old Bible, the one with the water-stained cover, and the pressed wildflower between Psalms and Proverbs that she'd put there herself at age 9 and never taken out. And then she'd sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and waited for morning, like a woman waiting for a verdict she already knew was going to go against her. Her father, Gerald Boone, had told her at supper the previous evening. Told her, not asked her. There was never any asking in the Boone household, not where Abigail was concerned. Caleb Whitaker up on the ridge sent word, Gerald said, not looking up from his plate. Wants a wife from a respectable family. I'm sending you. Charlotte, sitting across the table with her golden hair pinned perfectly and her small hands folded in her lap, had lifted one elegant eyebrow. Abigail. The word came out the way Charlotte always said Abigail's name, like it tasted slightly off. He doesn't know which daughter, Gerald said, and he won't until she's already there. Abigail had set down her fork very carefully. You're sending me as a trick. Gerald finally looked at her. I'm sending you because you ain't good for much else, and Whitaker's too far out to come complaining once he gets a look. Her stepmother Ruth pressed her lips together and said nothing. Ruth had perfected the art of saying nothing over 14 years of marriage to Gerald Boone. It was the only way she'd survived him. Abigail understood that even if it had never once made the silence easier to bear. Charlotte laughed. It was a small sound, almost delicate, but it landed like a slap. Lord Daddy, that's terrible. But she was still smiling when she said it. Abigail picked her fork back up. She finished her supper. She cleared the table. She washed every dish in that kitchen the way she had washed dishes in that kitchen for as long as she could remember, because there was nobody else who was going to do it. And she was not the kind of woman who left a mess behind her, even when the people around her deserved one. And then she went to her room and she cried until she couldn't anymore, and then she stopped. The wagon ride to Whitaker Ridge took the better part of a morning. The driver, a weathered man named Old Pete, who worked for the Boone family and had the good grace to keep his eyes on the road and his mouth shut, pulled up at the gate of the property just past 11 o'clock. The ranch stretched out ahead of her, wide and rough and wind-scoured, the kind of land that didn't apologize for what it was. There were cattle in the far pasture, fewer than she'd expected for a spread that size. The fence line along the south field needed work. She noticed both of these things before she noticed anything else, because that was the way Abigail Boone had always moved through the world, looking first at what needed fixing, cataloging problems, calculating solutions, while everyone around her was busy cataloging her. Old Pete helped her down from the wagon without being asked. He was one of the few people in her life who had consistently treated her like she was worth basic courtesy, and she thanked him quietly, and he tipped his hat, and then he drove away and left her standing there with her suitcase and her Bible, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being delivered somewhere like a package nobody ordered. She heard the door of the main house open before she turned around. Caleb Whitaker was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't certain what she'd expected. He was taller than most men she'd encountered, with the kind of lean build that came from actual labor rather than any vanity about it. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been set in a permanent position of not being surprised by much. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and a dark vest, and he walked toward her with the unhurried gait of a man who owned the ground he was crossing. He stopped about 6 feet away from her. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not cruelty, not the amused contempt she'd been bracing herself for. Not the particular kind of male disappointment she'd seen on men's faces all her life when they looked at her. Something else, something more careful. "You're from the Boone family," he said. "I am," Abigail said. She kept her chin level. She had decided on the wagon ride over that she was not going to look at the ground. Whatever happened next, she was going to see it coming. "I asked for a Boone daughter," he said. "Word I got back was that the arrangement was agreeable." "My father found it agreeable," Abigail said. "I was informed of it at supper last night." A muscle moved in Caleb's jaw. "I see. I imagine you were expecting my sister Charlotte." He didn't answer that directly. "I was told the elder daughter." "I am the elder daughter," Abigail said. "By 11 years. Charlotte is 15 and considerably more decorative, and I expect that is what my father was banking on when he sent me instead of her, that you'd be too far out to make the return trip worth your trouble." She didn't know exactly why she said it so plainly. Some part of her, she supposed, was tired of pretending. She'd spent 26 years allowing other people's cruelties to be smoothed over and explained away, and she found she had very little appetite for it left. Caleb Whitaker looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You want some coffee?" Abigail blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Coffee," he said. "You've been on a wagon since early morning. You want some or not?" Yes," she said. "Thank you." He picked up her suitcase before she could reach for it and carried it toward the house without any ceremony about it, and Abigail followed him. And that was how she arrived at Whitaker Ridge Ranch. The inside of the house was clean but spare, with the particular quality of a space that had been lived in by someone who had stopped decorating it the moment there was no longer anyone to decorate it for. She learned within the first hour that Caleb had been widowed 6 years prior. His wife Margaret had died of fever during a brutal winter, along with the infant she'd been carrying. He'd told Abigail this the way he told her most things, directly, and without embellishment over coffee at the kitchen table, as though information about his life was simply information and not something to be guarded or performed. "Why are you looking for a wife now?" she asked him. 6 years is a long time." "Ranch is falling apart," he said. "I've got 2 good hands left, a cook who's sick half the time, no bookkeeper since March, and a drought that's been going on 11 weeks. I need someone who can actually work. I thought a rancher's daughter might know how." Abigail looked at him across the table. "That is an extraordinarily practical reason to get married. Most practical decisions I ever made were the right ones," he said. He held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who meant what he said and didn't feel the need to soften it. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that you've just told me exactly what you need, and that you're not going to pretend otherwise, and I'm not certain how to react to that because nobody has done me that courtesy before." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not softness exactly, more like recognition. "Well," he said, "I find pretending expensive." He did not propose marriage again that day. Instead, he told her she was welcome to stay as a guest until they determined together whether the arrangement made sense. He gave her a room that was larger than the one she'd had at home, with a window that faced east, and a quilt that smelled like cedar, and he left her entirely alone for the remainder of the evening. Abigail sat on the edge of the bed in that room for a long time. Nobody had ever left her alone before in a way that felt like respect rather than punishment. She was up before dawn. She wasn't the kind of woman who slept late, and she wasn't the kind of woman who waited around to be told what needed doing when the evidence of what needed doing was available to anyone with functioning eyes. She'd taken a full inventory of the kitchen. The stores were low and badly organized. There was spoilage that could have been prevented, and whoever had been doing the accounts had clearly never met a ledger they couldn't confuse. She started with the kitchen. When Caleb came in at 6 in the morning, expecting nothing in particular, he found fresh biscuits on the table and a pot of coffee on the stove, and Abigail at the kitchen table with the household account books spread open in front of her and a pencil moving fast. He stopped in the doorway. "I hope you don't mind," she said without looking up. "The records go back 3 years, and someone has been calculating feed costs against the wrong column for the better part of 18 months. You've been overpaying your grain supplier by approximately 12%. Caleb walked to the table and looked over her shoulder at the page she was working on. He was quiet for a moment. "You read accounts. My mother taught me before she died," Abigail said. "My father found it useful until Charlotte was old enough to be pretty at people, after which he found me considerably less so." She looked up then and met his eyes. "I can fix this. All of it. I can fix your records and your supply situation, and probably your staffing problem, if you tell me what happened with the men who left." "Wages," he said. "I couldn't pay what Hale's operation was offering." "Victor Hale," she said. The name had come up twice the day before, once from Caleb and once from the cook. A broad-shouldered woman named Loretta, who'd been laid up with a chest cold, but had still managed to offer Abigail a thorough survey of the valley's political landscape from her sickbed. "He's been pulling workers from smaller ranches all summer. He's been doing more than that," Caleb said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and poured himself coffee, and there was something in the way he did it. The absence of any performance, the simple act of sitting across from her like she was a person worth sitting across from, that made her chest ache in a way she didn't entirely understand. "He's got a claim on the creek that supplies this ranch. Says he's got documents proving the water rights transferred to his family before my family ever bought this land." Abigail went very still. "Do you believe the documents are legitimate?" "No," Caleb said, "but believing and proving aren't the same thing." "No," she agreed, "they are not." She looked back down at the ledger in front of her. "Tell me everything you know about Hale's claim. All of it. Every detail." He did. They sat at that table for 2 hours, and he told her everything, and she listened, the way she'd always listened, carefully, completely filing information into its proper place, the way she'd once organized her father's supply shed, which nobody had ever thanked her for, but which had functioned perfectly for 7 years afterward. Caleb Whitaker watched her listen, and something in his face changed during those 2 hours, slowly, and without announcement, the way weather changes on the plains. By the time you notice it, it's already different from what it was. The 2 ranch hands who remained, Darnell, who was 40 and steady and young, Roy, who was 19 and trying, came in for breakfast and found a spread on the table that hadn't been there in months. Loretta had apparently roused herself from her sickbed and was sitting at the far end of the table, wrapped in a blanket, informing Abigail about the precise location of every supply she'd reorganized during the 3 years she'd been cook at Whitaker Ridge. "You moved the salt," Loretta said, pointing at the shelf with an air of personal injury. "It was next to the heat," Abigail said. "It was caking." Loretta squinted at her. Then she said, which from Loretta, as Abigail would learn, was high praise. Darnell sat down and looked at the biscuits, and then looked at Abigail with the guarded expression of a man who had been disappointed by too many things in recent seasons to offer enthusiasm freely. "You the Boone girl." "I am," Abigail said. "Heard your daddy sent you as a joke." The table went quiet. Roy looked like he wanted to disappear into the floorboards. Abigail set down the coffee pot she was holding. She looked at Darnell directly. "He did," she said. "And I am going to fix every broken thing on this ranch, and when I am done, nobody in this valley is going to remember the joke. So you can decide right now whether you want to be part of that or not." Darnell stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached for a biscuit. "Pass the butter," he said. That was the closest thing to acceptance she'd received in 26 years, and it tasted better than anything she'd ever known. The days that followed were the hardest and the fullest of Abigail's life. The drought was not easing. The creek was running lower than Caleb had ever seen it, and the pasture grass was burned yellow, and the cattle were losing weight that they couldn't afford to lose. She worked from before dawn until after dark without being asked. She renegotiated the grain supply contract herself, riding into town with a ledger full of evidence of overcharging and coming back with a corrected rate and a supplier who had the distinct expression of a man who had underestimated someone badly. She rebuilt the household stores against the principles of rationing that her mother had taught her during a lean winter when Abigail was 12 and nobody else in the Boone household had paid attention. She sat with Loretta in the evenings when the older woman's cough was bad, and they talked about the ranch, about the valley, about the slow creep of Victor Hale's influence over water and land, and the men who depended on both. "He's going to make his move soon," Loretta said one evening, her voice rough but certain. "Man like that, he doesn't wait when he thinks he's winning." "He thinks he's winning because he's been unopposed," Abigail said. "That's the first thing we need to change." Caleb was not an easy man to know. He spoke when he had something to say, and was silent when he didn't, which meant the silence around him was never empty. It was always full of the particular weight of a man who was paying attention. He watched Abigail work with an expression she still couldn't entirely decode, something between calculation and something warmer that he hadn't yet admitted to himself. He didn't compliment her. He didn't make speeches. But one afternoon, when she came in from the south pasture, where she'd been helping Darnell restake the fence line in the brutal afternoon heat, he brought her a cup of cold water and stood beside her while she drank it, and said nothing, and somehow that said more than most words she'd ever received. "You don't have to work like this," he said finally. "I know," she said. "Then why?" She handed him back the cup and looked out across the land that was his, the burned grass and the low creek, and the cattle moving in the distance, all of it precarious and stubborn and real. "Because it matters," she said. "Because the people on this land matter. Because when something matters, you work." He looked at her for a long moment. "Your family never deserved you," he said. It was the most direct thing he had said to her that wasn't about the ranch. She swallowed hard. She kept her eyes on the horizon. "No," she said quietly. "They didn't." That evening, Roy came riding hard from the south fence line with news that a section of Hale's operation had run cattle across the creek boundary, not accidentally, deliberately, churning the bank, muddying the water supply, leaving clear signs of territorial pressure. Abigail stood in the yard and listened to the boy's breathless report and felt something cold and clear settle in her chest. Hale was moving. Whatever happened next was going to determine not just the future of this ranch, but the future of every family in this valley who had the bad fortune of sitting between Victor Hale and something he wanted. Abigail Boone had spent 26 years being thrown away by people who should have known better. She was not going to let it happen to anyone else. Roy was still talking when Abigail walked past him toward the barn, not rudely. She heard every word he said. She simply had no use for standing still while the situation was moving, and Victor Hale's cattle churning up the creek bank was a situation that was very much moving. "Miss Abigail," Roy called after her. "Where are you?" "Saddle my horse," she said. "And then saddle yours." Caleb came out of the equipment shed at the sound of raised voices and took one look at her face and didn't ask questions. That was one of the things she had already learned to value about him. He read a situation before he opened his mouth, which put him ahead of most men she'd encountered. "Hale's men hit the south bank," he said. It wasn't a question. "Deliberately," she said. "Roy says boot prints, not hoof prints. They walked it. They stood there and let those cattle work that bank on purpose." She pulled the bridle from the hook and turned to face him. "He's testing you. He wants to know if you'll come out. And if I don't, then he knows you won't, and the next move is bigger." She met his eyes. "I want to see it myself before dark." Caleb didn't argue. He went for his own horse, and 20 minutes later, the three of them were riding south in the last of the afternoon light, and Abigail saw what Hale's men had done to the bank, and felt the cold clarity in her chest sharpen into something closer to anger. It was calculated damage. Every churn of that mud was a message written in a language she recognized from her father's house, of people who hurt things deliberately, and then smile and say they don't know what you're talking about. She dismounted and crouched at the edge of the bank and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "He'll claim it was an accident," Caleb said behind her. "Of course he will," she said. "That's why we're going to document it before the water clears." She looked up at Roy. "You can draw?" Roy blinked. "Ma'am? Maps? Diagrams? Can you put what you see onto paper accurately?" "My mother taught me some," he said uncertainly. "Then tomorrow morning, first light, you're going to draw me exactly what this bank looks like, every print, every disturbed stone, every mark. You're going to date it and sign it." She stood up. "Because a man like Victor Hale builds his power on the assumption that nobody is keeping records. We are going to be the people who keep records." Darnell, who had ridden out to meet them from the far pasture, sat on his horse and watched her with that same careful expression he'd been wearing since the morning of the biscuits. "You've dealt with men like Hale before," he said. "I've dealt with my father," she said. "Close enough." She didn't look at Caleb when she said it, but she felt him go still behind her. They rode back in the cooling dark, and Abigail spent the dinner hour at the kitchen table with Caleb's land documents spread across it, reading every line of the original creek boundary survey with the focused attention she'd once given to her father's account books, the ones that had revealed 3 years before she left that Gerald Boone had been quietly selling off parcels of the family land to cover gambling debts he'd never told anyone about. Information she'd kept to herself, because she'd known even then that knowing something and being able to use it were two different things. "Here," she said, pressing her finger to a line in the survey record. "The language of this boundary marker is referenced by compass bearing and natural landmark, not by the creek itself." Caleb leaned over her shoulder to look. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him after the long ride. She kept her eyes on the document. "What does that mean?" "It means if Hale's claim is based on water rights attached to the creek's path, and the creek has shifted in the last 30 years, which creeks do in drought and flood, they move then the landmark reference in this document may no longer match what Hale is claiming." She tapped the page. "His claim might be geographically invalid even if the paperwork looks clean." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's a narrow argument." "Narrow arguments win in courtrooms," she said. "Broad ones just make speeches." She finally looked up at him. He was closer than she'd realized, and the expression on his face was the one she'd been watching develop over the past week. The one she didn't have a word for yet, but that made something flutter uncomfortably in the vicinity of her sternum. She looked back at the document. "I need the oldest maps you have. Survey records, anything your father or grandfather kept. Hale's lawyers will have built this case on the assumption that you don't have them." "I might," Caleb said. He straightened up. "There's a trunk in the back room I haven't opened since the estate was settled." "Open it tonight," she said. He did. And at 11 o'clock that night, sitting on the floor of the back room with the trunk between them and documents spread across every available surface, Caleb Whitaker pulled out a hand-drawn survey map dated 1861, 26 years old, rendered in ink, faded to brown at the edges, that showed the original course of the creek feeding Whitaker Ridge, and the creek in that map did not run where it ran now. It had shifted. Significantly. Over decades of drought and snowmelt, it had moved a full 40 yards to the east, which meant Victor Hale's water claim attached to the original creek path, as recorded in his family's documents, was attached to a waterway that no longer existed where his papers said it did. Abigail sat back on her heels and stared at the map and felt something expand in her chest that she recognized distantly as hope. It was not an emotion she'd had much practice with. "This is your defense," she said. Caleb stared at the map. "If a judge believes it, a judge will believe a survey map dated 26 years ago over a claim filed by a man who's been buying up land all summer and pulling workers from neighboring ranches." She looked at him. "This is not just about the water, is it? Hale's been doing this to every smaller operation in the valley. You're not the only one with a problem." Caleb met her eyes. "No," he said, "I'm not." Then we don't fight this alone. She gathered the edges of the map carefully. Who are the other ranchers he's pressuring? What followed was the most productive and exhausting 2 weeks of Abigail's life. She rode out with Caleb to 3 neighboring operations, the McAllister spread to the north, the Reyes family's smaller ranch to the east, and the widow Cora Sims, who ran 40 head on her late husband's land, and had received a notice from Hale's lawyer just the previous month, claiming a right-of-way across her south pasture that would cut her cattle off from summer grazing. Each visit was the same, a family that had been fighting alone. Certain they were the only one too proud or too frightened to compare their situation with their neighbors. Abigail sat at Cora Sims' kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon and watched the older woman's face change as she realized she was not, in fact, the only one. "He told me nobody else was affected," Cora said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "He told each of you that," Abigail said. "That's how it works. You keep people isolated and they don't organize. You let them think they're alone and they give up." Cora looked at her with sharp gray eyes. "You're Gerald Boone's girl." "I was," Abigail said. "I'm not anymore." Cora studied her. "Your daddy's not a kind man." "No," Abigail said. "He's not. And you're nothing like him." Abigail held the older woman's gaze. "I have spent my entire life trying not to be." Cora reached across the table and covered Abigail's hand with her weathered one. "All right," she said. "What do we do?" The answer to that question took shape over the next 10 days in the form of a document that Abigail drafted herself, a joint affidavit signed by 4 neighboring ranch families, attaching their individual survey records, comparing the dates and nature of Hale's claims against each of them, and demonstrating a pattern that no single complaint could have shown. She worked on it every evening after the ranch chores were done by lamplight at Caleb's kitchen table, while Loretta, recovered now from her chest cold and fierce about it, kept a pot of coffee coming and occasionally leaned over to read a paragraph and say, "Good," or "Too weak, make it stronger." "You should have been a lawyer," Loretta told her one night. "I should have been a lot of things," Abigail said. "I'm starting now." It was during those evenings that she and Caleb began to really talk. Not about the ranch, not about Hale, but about actual things, the kind of conversation that happens between people who have both survived something and recognize that quality in each other without needing to name it. He told her about Margaret, not with grief that closed him off, but with the honest sorrow of a man who had loved someone and lost her, and carried that with him without letting it consume him. She told him about her mother, who had died when Abigail was 16 and left her alone in a house that had never been warm and became actively cold after that. "She used to tell me," Abigail said one evening, "that a woman's worth wasn't in what she looked like. It was in what she did when things got hard." Caleb looked at her across the table. She was right. "I know that," Abigail said. "I've always known it. Knowing something is true doesn't make it easy to believe when everyone around you is telling you the opposite." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You believe it now." She considered the question honestly. Outside, the night was wide and dark, and the ranch was quiet in the way it only got after 10 o'clock when the animals had settled, and the only sound was the occasional call of something far off in the distance. "I'm getting there," she said. He nodded, slow and deliberate. "Good," he said. And then he refilled her coffee without asking and went back to the land records he'd been reviewing, and she went back to her affidavit, and the silence between them was the most comfortable silence she had ever sat in. The first crack in the surface happened on a Friday. Abigail was in town at the general store picking up supplies and dropping off the first copy of the joint affidavit with Judge Harding's clerk, a careful legal step creating a paper trail before Hale could move, when she overheard 2 women talking behind the dry goods shelf. She recognized one voice. Nora Clemens, the wife of the bank manager, who had been at the church social. Caleb had taken Abigail to the previous Sunday with the specific intention of introducing her to the Valley's established families. "I don't know what Caleb Whitaker is thinking," Nora said, in the particular tone of a woman who knew exactly what she was thinking and wanted everyone else to know it too. "The Boone girl as well. You've seen her." She seems capable enough, the other woman said with the slightly uncomfortable note of someone who wasn't sure she wanted to be part of this conversation. Capable. Nora's voice carried the word the way some people carry something unpleasant. Well, I suppose if you need someone to do your accounts. But Caleb Whitaker is a significant man. He could have done considerably better. Abigail stood very still on her side of the shelf. She held a tin of coffee in her hands, and she breathed evenly, and she let herself feel the familiar sting of it, the old ache that never quite went away, no matter how many affidavits she drafted, or fence lines she restaked, or account books she corrected. It was still there. It would probably always be there. And then she set the coffee tin in her basket, and she walked around the end of the shelf, and she looked directly at Nora Clemens, and she said pleasantly, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Clemens." Nora went slightly pink. "Miss Boone," I couldn't help overhearing, Abigail said. "I want you to know I agree with you entirely. Caleb Whitaker is a significant man, which is why I've spent the past 2 weeks helping him build a legal case that's going to protect every ranch family in this valley from Victor Hale, including your husband's bank clients." She smiled, and it was her mother's smile, patient and clear, and not unkind, but absolutely immovable. "So I suppose it depends on your definition of doing better." She picked up the rest of her supplies and paid for them, and walked out of that store with her back straight and her chin level, and she did not let herself shake until she was around the corner of the building and out of sight. Then she stood there for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the wooden wall and breathed. She was still standing there when she heard boots on the boardwalk and looked up to find Caleb coming toward her from the direction of the livery. He took one look at her face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Town talk." His jaw tightened. "About you." She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. He read it on her face the way he'd learned to read the weather over the past weeks by watching the signs, rather than waiting to be told. "Abigail," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her first name without the miss, and it landed differently than she'd expected, somewhere in the center of her chest. "I want you to know something." She looked at him. "I'm not a man who lives by other people's opinions," he said. "Never have been. And I don't intend to start." It was not a declaration. It was not a speech. It was just a fact delivered by a man who dealt in facts. And it was somehow more powerful than any speech could have been. "I know," she said. "Good." He held out his arm to walk her back to the horses in full view of the entire main street of town, with the particular deliberateness of a man who was aware of exactly what he was communicating and had decided to communicate it. "Let's go home." She took his arm, and they walked. Behind them, she was fairly certain she could feel half the town watching. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward, and she walked beside Caleb Whitaker down the main street of that Wyoming town like she had every right in the world to be there. Because she did. They were halfway back to the ranch when Caleb spoke again. "The affidavit's been filed. With Judge Harding's clerk," she said, "before Nora Clemens gave me her opinion of my prospects." He made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "Good timing." "I thought so." They rode in easy silence for a while, and then he said without looking at her, "You know Hale's going to find out about the affidavit." "I'm counting on it," she said. "I want him to know we're organized before he makes his next move. A man like that plans on catching people by surprise. Take the surprise away, and he has to change tactics. Change tactics mean mistakes." Caleb was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him considering this, turning it over with that careful deliberateness he brought to every problem. "You think like a general," he said finally. "I think like a woman who spent 26 years watching powerful people underestimate her," she said. "It teaches you things." He turned to look at her, then fully the way he rarely did on horseback, a long, direct look with the late afternoon light behind him. "It did more than that," he said. She held his gaze for a beat, then looked back at the road ahead, because whatever was building between them was something she was not yet ready to examine too closely. Not out here in the open, where the sky was too big, and there was nowhere to hide from it. But she felt it. She felt it like the shift in the air before weather changes, present and undeniable, and coming whether she was ready for it or not. They rode back into the yard of Whitaker Ridge as the sun was going low, and Roy met them at the gate with the expression of a young man who is carrying news he doesn't quite know how to deliver. "What is it?" Caleb said. Roy twisted his hat in his hands. "Ryder came while you were in town. Left this." He held out an envelope. "It's from Hale's lawyer." Caleb took it. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at Abigail. She nodded once. He broke the seal and read it standing there in the yard in the fading light, and she watched his face go still and tight in the way it did when he was controlling something. "He's calling a town meeting," Caleb said. 3 weeks from Saturday. He says he intends to present his water rights claim formally before the whole community." The yard was quiet. Roy looked between them. Darnell had appeared from the direction of the barn and stood at the edge of the light waiting. Abigail looked at the envelope in Caleb's hand. She thought about the 1861 survey map and its protective casing on the desk inside. She thought about the joint affidavit filed with the judge's clerk. She thought about Cora Sims's gray eyes and the McAllisters' stubborn handshakes, and the Reyes family's careful signatures on a document that said in plain legal language that they had all been pushed far enough. "Good," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Good. He wants a public forum," she said. "So do I." 3 weeks. That was what they had, and Abigail intended to use every hour of it. The morning after Hale's letter arrived, she was up before Caleb, which was saying something because Caleb Whitaker had never in his adult life been the last person out of bed. He came into the kitchen at 5 in the morning and found her already at the table with the 1861 survey map, 2 lanterns burning, and a fresh pot of coffee that she'd clearly made an hour ago. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. "I've been thinking about the timeline," she said without looking up. Hale filed his water claim in April. That's 3 months after the drought started, which means he wasn't responding to the drought he anticipated it. He knew last winter that this summer was going to be dry, and he filed before anyone else started thinking about water. Caleb poured his coffee and sat down across from her. "You think he had information?" "I think he had a plan," she said. "And plans that detail don't start in April. They start years before that." She finally looked up. "How long has Hale been in this valley?" 8 years, Caleb said. "Bought the old Pearson place in '79. "And how long has he been acquiring smaller properties?" Caleb thought about it. "Seriously acquiring maybe 4 years. So he spent 4 years establishing himself, building relationships, getting people used to him, and then he started buying." She turned the survey map around so he could see the notation she'd circled. "There's a second survey referenced in this document, an 1849 territorial survey that predates your family's purchase of this land. I need to find it." Caleb set down his coffee. "Where would it be?" "The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne," she said. "Or it might be in the county records in town. If Hale's lawyers built their case on the 1861 survey without accounting for the 1849 one, and the 2 surveys conflict with each other, then his entire claim unravels." She held his gaze. "I need to go to the county office today." He didn't hesitate. "I'll ride with you." "You need to stay here," she said. "Hale's men came to the South Bank once. If word's gotten back to him that we filed the affidavit, and it has, he may try something before the meeting. Darnell can't watch the whole ranch alone." Caleb's jaw set. She recognized that expression by now. It was the one he wore when he disagreed with something, but could find no logical argument against it. "Roy goes with you," he said. "Roy goes with me," she agreed. She was in the county records office by 9 o'clock, with Roy waiting outside with the horses and a patience that exceeded his 19 years, because Abigail had told him this might take a while, and Roy had learned in 3 weeks that when Miss Abigail said something might take a while, she meant she was going to find what she was looking for, no matter how long it took. It took 4 hours. The county clerk, a small man named Jessup, with ink-stained fingers and the demeanor of someone who had spent decades in a room full of paper and preferred it to people, was initially resistant to pulling records from the 1849 Territorial Survey series. They were old, he explained. Fragile. Not generally available for public review without a formal legal request. Abigail put both hands flat on the counter and explained to him in a voice that was completely pleasant and absolutely inflexible that she was not requesting a formal legal process. She was requesting a public record that was legally available to any citizen of Wyoming Territory, and if he had a policy to the contrary, she would be very interested to see that policy in writing because her understanding of territorial records law was that no such policy existed. Jessup blinked at her. "The 1849 series," she said. "Please." He pulled the records, and there it was. The 1849 Territorial Survey of the Creek System feeding the Eastern Valley, conducted before any private land claims had been established, showing not just the creek's original path, but something far more significant. A notation in the surveyor's hand indicating that the water source was a shared community resource under territorial charter, predating any private claim, which meant that any subsequent water rights filing was legally subordinate to the original territorial designation. Hale's lawyers had either missed it or buried it. Abigail stood at that counter and read the notation 3 times to be certain she was reading it correctly. Then she asked Jessup for a copy, which he made with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had just watched something happen that he hadn't expected, and she walked out of that office into the afternoon sun and found Roy exactly where she'd left him. "Well," he said. "We just won," she said. "We just don't get to use it yet." Roy stared at her. "Why not?" "Because if we show this before the town meeting, Hale's lawyers have 3 weeks to find a counter-argument or a compliant judge." She folded the copy carefully and put it inside her coat against her chest. "We show it in public in front of witnesses where there's no time to maneuver. We wait." Roy thought about this for a moment. "That's a nerve-wracking plan, ma'am." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." They were a mile from Whitaker Ridge when Roy suddenly pulled his horse up short. Abigail reined in beside him and followed his gaze to the road ahead where a wagon had stopped. A very familiar wagon. The Boone family wagon with her father's brand on the side panel, and Gerald Boone sitting up on the seat with the reins in his hands and an expression that told her he had been waiting. Beside him on the seat sat Charlotte. Abigail's hands tightened on her reins once briefly, and then she made herself relax them. She rode forward. Her father looked at her the way he always had, assessing, calculating, finding the number that came up short. Charlotte sat perfectly arranged in a pale blue traveling dress, her golden hair pinned under a small hat, and she was looking at Abigail with an expression that mixed pity and triumph, in a ratio that Abigail recognized from a lifetime of watching it. "Abigail," her father said. "Father," she said. "This is unexpected." "Heard Whitaker's having trouble," Gerald said. "Thought we'd come offer some support." "That's very charitable," Abigail said, "considering you sent me here as a joke." Gerald's face tightened. "Now I don't know what you've been telling people." "The truth," she said. "I've been telling people the truth. It's a habit I've developed." She looked at Charlotte. "Hello, Charlotte." Charlotte smiled at her the way a cat smiles at something small and cornered. "Abigail, you look well, considering." "Considering what?" Abigail said. The smile didn't waver. "Considering everything, Father," Abigail said, turning back to Gerald. "Whatever you've come here to do, I want you to know that Caleb Whitaker is not a man who can be managed. And I am not a problem you can solve by replacing me with Charlotte." She held his gaze. "So, if that's the plan, I'd strongly advise you to turn this wagon around." Gerald Boone looked at his eldest daughter for a long moment, with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, something that might have been in a different man, a flicker of discomfort. "The ranch is doing better," he said finally. "People in town are saying that's because of you." "It is because of me," she said. "And Caleb and Darnell and Roy and Loretta and the McAllisters and the Reyeses and Cora Sims and everyone else who decided they weren't going to let Victor Hale take what belonged to them." She gathered her reins. "You're welcome to come to the ranch, but I'm telling you plainly what you'll find there. She rode on without waiting for an answer, and she heard Roy scramble to catch up behind her, and she did not look back. She told Caleb the moment she got in. He listened without interrupting, which was his way, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your father wants Charlotte to replace you." "He wants access to whatever he thinks you have," Abigail said. "Charlotte is the method." "And what do you think I have?" She looked at him. "A winning legal case against the most powerful man in the valley, and a ranch that's been turned around from the edge of failure in 3 weeks. Word travels, Caleb. My father has always had a nose for a rising situation." He nodded slowly. "He's going to make trouble at the town meeting." "He's going to try," she said. "We need to be ready for that too." Gerald and Charlotte Boone arrived at the ranch that evening in a performance of graciousness that Abigail recognized as her father's most dangerous mode. He was charming when he wanted something, and he wanted something badly enough to drive half a day in summer heat to get it. He complimented the ranch. He praised Caleb's cattle operation with the knowledgeable eye of a man who understood ranching. He was warm to Darnell and kind to Roy, and appropriately respectful to Loretta, who watched him from across the room with the expression of a woman who had encountered his type before and was not fooled. Charlotte was another matter. Charlotte was 26 years younger than the game she was playing, but she had been trained in it since childhood, and she played it well. She was demure with Caleb, interested in everything he said, beautifully arranged at every moment. She was not unkind to Abigail directly. She was something more effective than unkind. She was pointed. Abigail was always so capable, she told Caleb over supper with a sweetness that had edges. We relied on her for everything at home. The accounts, the cooking, the mending. She's wonderfully practical. She is, Caleb said, and his voice was level, and his eyes didn't move to Charlotte the way Charlotte had clearly expected them to. Charlotte regrouped beautifully. "I just worry about her doing all this hard work. She's not built for it." The table went quiet. Abigail set down her fork very carefully the way she'd set it down at her father's table the night she'd been told she was being sent away. She looked at Charlotte across the table. "I'm sorry," she said pleasantly. "What was that?" Charlotte's smile was practiced and pretty. "I only mean you work so hard, Abigail. You always have. But there are limits, aren't there, to what a person can?" "Charlotte." Caleb's voice was quiet. Not loud, just quiet in the particular way that made the air in the room change. "The woman sitting next to me has in 3 weeks corrected 3 years of accounting errors, renegotiated our grain supply contract, organized 4 neighboring ranches into a legal coalition against the most powerful land baron in this valley, and found a piece of territorial law that is going to take Victor Hale apart in public." He looked at Charlotte with a directness that left no room for prettiness to operate. "There are no limits, I've observed." Charlotte opened her mouth, closed it. Her father, to his credit, recognized a losing position and changed the subject smoothly, and the supper continued, but the temperature in the room had shifted in a way that everyone at the table felt. Later, when the dishes were done and the house was settling into night, Abigail was at the kitchen table with her notes for the town meeting when she heard the floorboard in the hallway and looked up to find Charlotte standing in the doorway in her nightgown, her golden hair loose, her face stripped of its supper performance. She looked younger without it, and something else, something that surprised Abigail. She looked tired. "He's going to try to embarrass you at the meeting," Charlotte said without preamble. "Daddy, he's going to say Caleb was deceived, that you manipulated the situation. He thinks if he makes Caleb look foolish for choosing you, Caleb will want to restore his dignity by making a different choice." Abigail looked at her sister for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" Charlotte leaned against the doorframe. Something moved across her face that might, in different lighting, have been shame. "Because I'm tired," she said. "I've been doing what Daddy tells me to do since I was old enough to be pretty at people, and I'm tired of it." She looked at Abigail with an honesty that Abigail had never seen from her before. "You got out." "He threw me out," Abigail said. "Same result," Charlotte said quietly. Abigail considered her for a long moment. The girl in the door night Abigail was sent away. Or maybe she was, and that Charlotte had always had this underneath her, and Abigail had never been given a reason to look. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. Charlotte pushed off the doorframe. "Don't thank me. Just don't let him win." She looked at Abigail with an expression that held no prettiness, and no edge, and no performance. Just something plain and honest. "You're the only person in this family who never needed his approval to know you were worth something. I always hated that about you." A pause. "I think I was jealous of it." She went back to her room without another word, and Abigail sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the sleeping ranch, and stared at her notes and felt the shape of the next week rearrange itself in her mind. She was ready for Gerald Boone. She was ready for Victor Hale. What she hadn't been ready for was the fire. It started 4 days before the town meeting in the dry grass on the eastern ridge, and it moved fast. Summer fires in Wyoming moved fast. The land was tinder dry and the wind was steady, and the fire didn't care about property lines or legal affidavits or plans that had been 3 weeks in the making. The first sign was the smell reaching the ranch yard at dusk, and then the glow on the ridge, and then Roy's voice from the upper pasture at a volume that told Abigail everything she needed to know before he even got the words out. "Fire on the east ridge, it's coming down." The ranch went from still to chaos in the space of 30 seconds. Caleb was already shouting orders before Abigail reached the yard, his voice cutting through the noise with the authority of a man who had been running this land for 15 years and knew exactly what a fire like this could do. Darnell was at the cattle pen. Roy was at the water barrel. Loretta appeared at the kitchen door with wet burlap in her arms, already prepared, because Loretta had lived through prairie fires before, and she did not waste time being surprised. Gerald Boone came out of the guest room looking like a man who had not planned for this. Charlotte was right behind him, her traveling dress replaced with practical clothes she'd changed before coming out, which told Abigail something important about her sister that the supper performance had hidden. "The Reyes family's grazing land is on that ridge," Abigail said to Caleb. She was already moving for the barn. "Their summer cattle are up there." "We can't," he started. "I know where their upper pasture gate is," she said. "I rode it last week. I can get the cattle down before the fire reaches the bottom fence." She was saddling her horse as she said it, her hands moving fast and sure. "Send Roy to the McAllisters. They'll need help on the north side. You stay here and protect the home pasture." "Abigail." "Caleb." She looked at him over the horse's back. "Trust me." A beat. One breath. "Come back," he said. She rode. The fire was moving faster than it looked from the yard, the way fires always did. Distance made them seem manageable right up until the moment they weren't. She rode hard for the ridge, and she could feel the heat before she reached the upper gate, and she could hear the cattle, that particular panicked sound that cattle made when fire was in the air, a sound that went straight to the base of the brain and said, "Run." She got the gate open, and she rode into the pasture, and she worked shouting and waving, and using the horse the way Caleb had taught her, without ever formally teaching her reading the animals, and cutting off the wrong turns, and pushing them down toward the lower fence line. 40 cattle in a dark field, with fire on the ridge above her, and smoke thickening the air. She got 37 of them through the lower gate before a burning branch came down from the tree line, and her horse shied hard, and she nearly went off. Caught herself by instinct, and grip and sheer stubbornness, hauled the horse's head around, and got the last 3 cattle through the gate herself on foot, running at them in the smoke and heat, with her arms wide, because there was no other way to do it. She was latching the gate when she found the saddlebag. It was hanging on the fence post at the lower gate, tied there deliberately, not dropped, tied with the kind of careful knot that a person in a hurry doesn't make. Inside the bag was a document. Several documents. She couldn't read them properly in the dark and the smoke, but she could see enough Hale's name and the creek survey and a date from 2 months ago, and the signature of a county surveyor she recognized from the records office. Someone had left evidence at a fence post in the middle of a fire, either as a warning or as a gift. She stuffed the saddlebag inside her coat and rode back to the ranch at a flat gallop, and Caleb met her at the yard gate with an expression that told her he'd been watching the ridge for the past hour, and the past hour had cost him something. "The Reyes cattle are safe," she said before he could speak. "All 40. She pulled the saddlebag from inside her coat and held it out to him. "And I found this." He took it, opened it, read the first page in the light from the barn door. His face went very still. "This is the original survey Hale commissioned," he said. "The one his claim is based on." "Look at the date on the surveyor's certification," she said. He found it. She watched him find it, and she watched his face change. "This was certified 2 months ago," he said. "The survey itself is dated 4 years ago, but the certification is a forgery," she said. "The surveyor certified a document retroactively, which means Hale didn't just file a fraudulent claim. He fabricated the evidence to support it. That's not a civil matter." She held his gaze. "That's criminal." The fire burned through the night, and they fought it through the night, and by dawn it had spent itself on the bare rock of the upper ridge without reaching the home pasture or the creek, and the Whitaker Ridge Ranch was standing. And Abigail Boone stood in the yard in the early light, with smoke in her hair and ash on her coat, and the most important piece of evidence in the valley tucked safely inside her jacket. And she looked at the horizon, and she thought about the town meeting that was 3 days away. Victor Hale had planned everything carefully. He'd anticipated drought and isolation, and the particular despair of people fighting alone. He had not planned for her. 3 days was not enough time to sleep. Abigail didn't try. She cleaned up from the fire, changed her clothes, drank 3 cups of Loretta's coffee, and sat back down at the kitchen table. With the saddlebag documents spread in front of her, like a hand of cards, she needed to play exactly right. The fraudulent certification was the centerpiece, but a single document didn't build a case. It opened one. She needed to understand the full architecture of what Hale had constructed before she could take it apart in public, because a man like Victor Hale did not build on one pillar. He built redundancies. He built escape routes. He built the kind of layered deception that collapsed completely, only if you found the right load-bearing wall and hit it hard enough. Caleb sat across from her for most of that first night, not talking, just present in the way he had of being present solidly, without performance, like a man who understood that sometimes the most useful thing you could offer another person was your company and your silence. At 2 in the morning, he said, "You need to sleep." "I need to understand how he moved the money," she said without looking up. "The survey fraud proves the claim is false, but Hale has lawyers and the lawyers have judges. The only way to make this bulletproof in front of a public audience is to show them not just that he forged a document, but why what he stood to gain, what he already took from people who didn't know they were being robbed." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he got up and refilled both their coffees and sat back down and said, "Tell me what you need." That was the moment, though she wouldn't name it as such until much later. Not the walk down the main street with his arm offered to her, not the supper where he'd defended her to Charlotte, not any of the smaller moments that had been accumulating like water behind a dam for 3 weeks. It was that sentence at 2 in the morning with ash still faintly in the air and the documents between them. "Tell me what you need. Not what can I do, not let me handle it. Not the various shapes that help takes when it comes with conditions attached. Just that." She told him what she needed. He provided it. The ranch books going back 8 years. His father's correspondence from the original land purchase. Every interaction he'd had with Hale or Hale's representatives, recalled in the precise chronological detail of a man with a very good memory and the habit of paying attention. By 4 in the morning, the picture that had been assembling itself in pieces for 3 weeks finally had enough of its edges filled in to be recognizable. Hale had been working this plan for 4 years. He'd started with the smaller operations, the ones with the least capital and the fewest options. Pressing water claims, filing right-of-way challenges, making legal arguments that cost money to fight, even when they were baseless, because the fighting cost more than the losing for a family running 40 head on a thin margin. Some had sold. Some had simply abandoned claims rather than spend a legal winter trying to defend them. The Whitaker Ridge was the largest independent operation still standing, and once it fell, there would be nothing between Hale and total valley control. The water rights claim wasn't just about water. It was the last step. "He's been clearing the board," Abigail said, "for 4 years, and we've all been looking at our own piece of it and not seeing the whole." "Until now," Caleb said. "Until now," she agreed. She slept for 3 hours before dawn. She would not sleep properly for another 3 days. Gerald Boone announced at breakfast the next morning that he intended to attend the town meeting. He said it pleasantly, as though it were a natural thing, as though he were a concerned neighbor, rather than a man who had driven half a day to position his younger daughter next to a rancher he'd identified as a rising prospect. Abigail looked at him across the breakfast table and said equally pleasantly that of course he was welcome. It was a public meeting. Charlotte, who had been quiet since her nighttime visit to the kitchen, caught Abigail's eye briefly across the table. The look lasted less than a second. It was enough. Darnell left for the McAllisters that morning with a message Abigail had written out the night before a full briefing on the documents. She'd found the 1849 territorial survey and the plan for the meeting. She needed the other families ready. She needed them standing when the moment came, not sitting in their chairs, waiting to be told how this would go. The McAllisters sent back word by noon they were in. The Reyeses sent word an hour later. Cora Sims's reply came in the form of Cora Sims herself, riding up to the ranch gate mid-afternoon with her Sunday coat on and her late husband's law books in a satchel on her saddle. "My husband passed the bar," Cora told Abigail in the yard. "He never practiced, but I read everything he owned, and I have been reading it again since Tuesday." She patted the satchel. "You're not walking into that meeting alone." Abigail looked at her for a moment and felt that unfamiliar expansion in her chest again. The thing that was related to hope, but was larger than hope. That had to do with the specific sensation of not being alone, that she had so rarely experienced, that she still didn't entirely know how to receive it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Cora said, which was apparently something the women of this valley said to each other by way of meaning, "You're worth it. Just win." The day before the meeting, Hale made his move. It was not subtle. Hale was a man who had operated without opposition for 4 years, and the saddlebag documents had clearly reached him. Someone had talked, or he had better eyes on Whitaker Ridge than they'd accounted for. 2 of his men rode onto the property at midday, nominally, to serve what they called a preliminary injunction, preventing Abigail from presenting any documents at the town meeting on the grounds that the evidence had been obtained outside of proper legal process. Abigail read the paper they handed her standing in the ranch yard, with both men on horseback in front of her, and Caleb and Darnell flanking her on either side. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully. "This isn't a court order," she said. "It has no judge's signature. It's a letter from Hale's personal lawyer with a court-sounding heading." She held it back out to the man who'd delivered it. "You can take it back." The man didn't take it. "Mr. Hale says." "Mr. Hale doesn't have jurisdiction over a public town meeting," she said. "And neither does his lawyer. If Mr. Hale wants to file an actual injunction with an actual judge, he has until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to do so, because that's when the meeting starts." She extended the paper further. "Take it back." A long pause. The man took the paper. They rode out. Caleb watched them go, then looked at Abigail. "He's scared," he said. "He's desperate," she said. "Which is more dangerous?" She turned to Darnell. "Double the watch tonight. Both fence lines." Darnell nodded once and went. The night passed without incident. Whether that was because Hale had decided against a physical play, or because he had something else in reserve, Abigail didn't know. She stayed at the kitchen table until midnight, reviewing her presentation one final time, and then she put the documents in careful order in the leather case Caleb had given her, without comment. His own traveling case, good leather, solid clasps. And she went to bed and she lay in the dark, and she thought about her mother. Her mother had told her once when she was very small before the illness, before Gerald Boone's particular brand of casual cruelty had calcified into household atmosphere, that the most powerful thing a woman could do was walk into a room as though she had every right to be there. Not loudly, not with performance, Just the simple, immovable conviction of someone who knew her own worth and had decided it was not up for debate. Abigail had spent 26 years practicing that. She had practiced it at her father's table and at every gathering where people looked at her and found her wanting and said so with their eyes. She had practiced it on the wagon ride to Whitaker Ridge and in Caleb Whitaker's kitchen and at Nora Clemens's dry goods counter and in the county records office and on a ridge in the middle of a fire with 40 panicked cattle and smoke burning her eyes. Tomorrow she was going to practice it in front of the entire valley. She slept 4 hours. She woke before the sun. The town meeting was held in the largest building in town, the feed and grain warehouse on the south end of Main Street, because it was the only space that could hold the number of people who showed up. Abigail had not expected this many. She had expected ranchers and their wives, the judge, the banker, the lawyer contingent. She had not expected 3 rows of townspeople in the back who had apparently come simply because word had traveled that something significant was happening and they wanted to see it. She had not expected the 2 newspaper correspondents she spotted near the side wall with their notebooks out. She filed this information away without changing her pace. Victor Hale was already at the front of the room when they arrived with 2 lawyers flanking him and 3 men she didn't recognize sitting in a row behind him. Hale himself was a large man in his late 50s, with the broad build of someone who had once done physical work and had transitioned to managing it, and the particular smoothness of a man who had spent years cultivating the appearance of reasonableness. He looked at Abigail when she walked in with Caleb, and he looked at her the way powerful men who underestimate women always looked at them, noting her presence without adjusting his expectations. That was his first mistake. Gerald Boone had positioned himself in the 3rd row, which placed him centrally visible without appearing aggressive. Charlotte sat beside him. Charlotte, Abigail noted, was looking at the floor. Judge Harding called the meeting to order at 9 o'clock exactly, and Victor Hale began his presentation. He was good. She would give him that. He was smooth and reasonable and neighborly, with the ease of a man who'd made this kind of argument before and won. He presented his claim in plain language, referring to his lawyers only for the documentary support, and he framed the whole thing as a matter of legal record being set right, not aggression, not acquisition, just the correction of a long-standing misunderstanding about the water rights. That should, he said regretfully, have been addressed years ago. He presented his survey. He presented his certification. He presented the transfer documents. When he finished, the room was quiet with the particular quality of people who are waiting to see if what they've just heard is as solid as it sounded. Judge Harding looked out over the room. "Is there a response from the Whitaker interest?" Abigail stood up. She heard the small sounds that rippled through the room. Not hostility, more like recalibration, the sound a crowd makes when what appears is not what they expected. She had dressed carefully that morning not to perform, but to be taken seriously. Her best dark dress, her hair pinned with the practicality of a woman who was here to work, not to be decorative. She carried Caleb's leather case, and she set it on the table at the front of the room, and she opened it without hurry. "My name is Abigail Boone," she said. "I have been managing the accounts and operations of Whitaker Ridge Ranch for the past 3 weeks, and I appear today on behalf of that ranch and in conjunction with the McAllister, Reyes, and Sims ranch families, all of whom have received similar legal pressure from Mr. Hale's operation in the past 12 months. She heard Hale's lead lawyer say something quiet to his colleague. She ignored it. "Mr. Hale has presented a survey and certification that he claims establishes his family's water rights over the creek supplying Whitaker Ridge." She laid the 1849 territorial survey on the table facing the judge. "I'd like to present the 1849 territorial survey of this creek system, which predates any private claim in this valley by 30 years, and which designates the water source as a shared community resource under territorial charter. This designation is legally superior to any subsequent private filing, which means Mr. Hale's claim, regardless of its documentary support, is subordinate to a public right that cannot be privately transferred." The room moved. She felt it before she heard it, the shifting of weight in chairs, the intake of breath. Hale's lawyer was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is an ambush presentation without proper—" "It's a public document from the county records office," Abigail said, still looking at the judge. "Filed with the clerk and available to any citizen. Mr. Hale's lawyers have had equal access to it." She paused. "I can only assume they chose not to present it." Judge Harding held up his hand and the lawyer sat down. Abigail reached into the case again. "Additionally, I'd like to present the survey certification that Mr. Hale's lawyers filed with his water claim." She placed it on the table beside the territorial survey, and beside it, for comparison, the independent county surveyor's records showing that this certification bears a date of 2 months ago attached to a survey document dated 4 years ago. She looked up at the judge. The surveyor certified a document retroactively after the claim was filed. This is not a procedural irregularity. It is evidence of fabrication. The room stopped being polite. Victor Hale was on his feet. His lawyers were pulling at his sleeve, and he was ignoring them because men like Hale, when they felt the ground move, reached for volume the way they'd always reached for it. "This woman has no standing," he started. "Mr. Hale." Judge Harding's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Hale stopped. The judge looked at the documents on the table for a long moment. Then he looked at Hale's lawyers. "Gentlemen, is there an explanation for the certification date discrepancy?" The silence from Hale's table was the loudest thing in the room. And then Gerald Boone stood up. Abigail had been expecting this. She had prepared for it. She had told herself in the kitchen at 2 in the morning that she was ready. And she found as her father rose in the 3rd row with his rancher's bearing and his confident voice, that she had been right and wrong simultaneously. She was ready. And it still cost her something to hear it. "Your Honor," Gerald said, "I feel obliged to point out that the woman presenting this evidence was sent to Whitaker Ridge under false pretenses. She was not formally contracted as a legal agent for that ranch. Any documents she obtained or presented may be challenged on the basis of her standing to obtain them." He paused, and Abigail recognized the pause. It was the one he used when he wanted the next thing to land with weight. "Furthermore, I believe the court should know that Caleb Whitaker was intended to receive my younger daughter Charlotte as his intended, not Abigail. The arrangement made with my family was misrepresented, and I'm not certain any agreement made on that basis is—" "Mr. Boone." Caleb's voice came from beside Abigail, and it was the quietest voice in the room, and it stopped Gerald Boone mid-sentence. Caleb stood up. He didn't look at Hale. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at Gerald Boone with the complete steady attention of a man who has decided exactly what he wants to say and is going to say it. "I know what arrangement you made," he said. "I know you sent your daughter as a joke. I know you expected me to send her back, and I know you came here this week because you found out she'd turned this ranch around and you wanted the credit for it, or the connection to it, or both." He let that sit for one beat. Abigail Boone came to Whitaker Ridge with 1 suitcase and a Bible and 3 years of accounting errors to fix, and in 3 weeks, she built a legal case that is taking apart the most powerful fraudulent operation in this valley. Her standing on this ranch is not in question. Her standing as the person I intend to make my wife is not in question. He looked at his father-in-law with the steadiness of a man who has no patience left for pretending. "The only thing that was ever misrepresented in this situation, Mr. Boone, was your daughter's worth, and that misrepresentation was yours." Gerald Boone sat down. The room was absolutely still. Abigail stood at the front of it and felt the stillness like something physical. 300 people breathing in the same direction, watching, and the weight of all of it pressing on her chest in a way that was not quite pain and not quite joy, but something in between that she didn't have a word for. She turned back to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, and her voice was steady, "I have 3 more documents." By 11 o'clock, Victor Hale's water claim was suspended pending criminal investigation of the certification fraud. By noon, Judge Harding had issued a temporary protection order covering all 4 ranch families' water access, pending full review of the 1849 territorial designation. By 1 o'clock, Hale's lead lawyer had quietly requested a private conference with the judge, which everyone in the valley understood to mean that the negotiation phase had begun and the fighting phase was over. And Gerald Boone left town before supper with Charlotte beside him in the wagon, and this time he did not wait to see if anyone noticed his departure. Charlotte looked back once from the wagon seat as they pulled out of the main street. Abigail was standing on the boardwalk with Caleb and Cora Sims and the McAllisters and the Reyeses, and their eyes met across the distance. Charlotte lifted her chin in something that was not quite a nod and not quite a salute, but carried the weight of both. Abigail held her gaze until the wagon turned the corner. Then Cora Sims linked her arm through Abigail's on one side, and the eldest McAllister daughter linked the other, and someone from the crowd, she never found out who started clapping, and it spread, and the boardwalk was full of the particular sound of people who have been frightened for a long time, and have just remembered that they don't have to be. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the afternoon was long, Caleb stood beside her on the boardwalk and said nothing for a while. The town moved around them with the restored energy of people who have had a weight lifted. "You said intended," Abigail said. He looked at her. "I did." In front of the judge and 300 people. "I did," he said again, and there was nothing in his voice but the plain fact of it offered without decoration, which was exactly the way he offered everything that mattered. She looked out at the street, at the town that had watched her arrive 3 weeks ago as someone's joke, and was now watching her stand here as something else entirely. At the land beyond it, Whitaker Ridge, sitting on the horizon, where it had always sat stubborn and enduring, waiting to be taken care of by someone who knew how. "I reckon," she said slowly, "that's a conversation we should have properly." "I reckon it is," he said. He offered her his arm. She took it, and they walked off the boardwalk together into the afternoon, and the sun was warm and the valley that had tried to swallow them whole lay open and manageable ahead of them. And Abigail Boone walked through it like a woman who had every right to be exactly where she was. Because she did. The conversation happened 3 days later. Not because either of them was avoiding it, they were both past avoidance, past the particular game of pretending that what was plainly true was somehow still in question. It happened 3 days later, because for 3 days there was still work to do, and work for both of them was not something you set aside because the emotional weather had changed. Victor Hale's operation was unraveling in the slow, grinding way that legal processes unraveled, and the 4 ranch families needed documentation, prepared statements organized, and a clear record established before Hale's lawyers found their footing again. Abigail spent those 3 days at the table at the records office, at Cora Sims's kitchen, and the McAllister front porch building, the kind of paper foundation that would hold long after the public drama had faded into valley memory. She also spent those 3 days aware with a precision she could not turn off of exactly where Caleb Whitaker was in any given room. She was not accustomed to this. She had spent 26 years making herself invisible in rooms, moving through them efficiently and without drawing attention, cataloging what needed doing, and doing it. She had never had the experience of someone tracking her back, of sensing, without looking, that another person in the room was aware of her the way she was aware of him. It was disorienting in the specific way of things that are new and good, because she had so little practice with new and good that she kept waiting for it to resolve into something more familiar. It didn't. On the 3rd evening, Caleb found her on the porch after supper. The sky was going orange and purple in the west, the way Wyoming skies went in late summer, extravagant and unapologetic, and the ranch was settling into its evening sounds, the cattle in the far pasture, the horses shifting in the barn. Roy's voice, somewhere near the equipment shed, talking to Darnell about something in the uncomplicated way of 2 people who had worked beside each other long enough to be easy together. Caleb sat down in the chair beside hers, and they were quiet for a while, which was something they had learned to do together, the particular silence of 2 people who didn't need to fill space because the space between them was already full. "That conversation," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean." "I know that about you," she said. "What I said in that meeting room in front of the judge and the whole valley and your father." He turned to look at her. "I meant it before I said it. I wasn't saying it to shut your father down, though it did that too. I was saying it because it was the truest thing in the room, and it was time someone said it out loud." Abigail looked at him. The evening light was doing something unfair to his face, the way evening light in Wyoming sometimes did, and she held his gaze with the steadiness she'd practiced all her life in situations that were significantly less worth being steady for. "Caleb, I came here in a wagon with one suitcase because my father thought sending me to you was a punishment for both of us. I know. I have spent my entire life being told in every language people use to tell each other things without saying them directly that I was not the person anyone would choose." She said it plainly because that was how she said things that cost her something plainly without decoration, so there was no mistaking what she meant. "I'm asking you to be certain, because I can survive a great many things. I have proven that, but I would rather not have to survive being wrong about this." He looked at her for a long time with that careful, complete attention that she had come to understand was his most fundamental form of respect. Then he said, "I have been living on this ranch for 15 years. I ran it with Margaret, and I loved her, and then she was gone, and I ran it alone for 6 years, and I was managing. I was keeping things going. I thought that was enough." He paused. "And then you came down from a wagon with a battered suitcase and told me inside of 5 minutes that my grain supplier had been overcharging me for 18 months, and by the end of the first week I could not imagine this ranch without you in it." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to stay because the ranch needs you. The ranch does need you. But that's not why I'm asking." "Why are you asking?" she said. "Because I need you," he said. Simply without embellishment, the way he said everything that was real. "And I think maybe you've needed somewhere to be needed back. Not used, needed. There's a difference." She felt the thing in her chest that she'd been managing carefully for 3 weeks finally stop being manageable. It didn't break. She was not a woman who broke. It opened the way a door opens when someone finally finds the right key, and what came through it was not fragile at all. It was the oldest, most durable part of her, the part that had survived Gerald Boone's supper table, and Charlotte's pretty cruelty, and 26 years of a world that had looked at her and found her wanting. That part of her recognized something in Caleb Whitaker that it had never expected to find, and it was not inclined to be cautious about it. "Yes," she said. "There is a difference." "So." He reached across the space between their chairs and offered her his hand, palm up in the simple, straightforward way of a man proposing a partnership, which was, she understood exactly what it was and exactly what she wanted it to be. "Will you stay?" She looked at his hand. At the calluses and the honest wear of it, the hand of a man who worked his own land and didn't apologize for it. She looked at his face, at the steadiness there that had been the first thing she'd trusted about him on the very first day when he'd said, "You came all this way. You'll have a roof tonight," and given her the first dignity she'd received in years. She put her hand in his. "Yes," she said. "I'll stay." He closed his hand around hers, and they sat together on the porch of Whitaker Ridge Ranch and watched the Wyoming sky finish its evening performance, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else, because everything that needed saying had been said, and the rest of it was going to be lived. They were married 6 weeks later on the ranch, with Judge Harding officiating and every family from the Valley Coalition in attendance. Cora Sims stood beside Abigail in lieu of any family Abigail wished to claim, which suited Abigail perfectly, because Cora was exactly the kind of witness she wanted, sharp-eyed and honest and inclined to cry only once briefly during the vows, and then collect herself immediately and pretend it hadn't happened. Darnell and Roy stood with Caleb Roy, managing the occasion with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a young man who had not expected his employment at a struggling ranch to include witnessing its complete transformation. Loretta had cooked for 3 days straight and announced at the reception that she was retiring in 6 months, and Abigail had better learn her biscuit recipe before then, which Abigail took as the deepest possible expression of love, and said so, which made Loretta waver off and refill everyone's coffee. Charlotte came. She arrived 2 days before the wedding alone without Gerald with a carpetbag, and the quiet self-possession of a young woman who had made a decision and was committed to it. She stood in the yard of Whitaker Ridge and looked at Abigail and said, "I didn't come to make trouble." "I know," Abigail said. "I came because you're my sister," Charlotte said. "And I have done a poor job of that my entire life, and I would like if you're willing to begin doing it better." Abigail looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the kitchen in the dark. She thought about Charlotte's face stripped of its performance. She thought about her mother, who had believed in the possibility of people being better than they'd been, and had tried to teach that to a daughter who hadn't always had the safety to practice it. "Come inside," Abigail said. "Loretta's made supper." Charlotte came inside. She stayed for the wedding and for 2 weeks after it, and she helped with the horses and the kitchen. And one morning, Abigail found her at the account books working through the quarterly figures with a concentration that was entirely unlike her supper performance, and entirely like someone who had been waiting for permission to be useful. They didn't talk about their father. They didn't need to. Some histories were better acknowledged than excavated, and the acknowledgement was in Charlotte's presence and Abigail's welcome of it, and that was enough to begin with. The legal process against Victor Hale concluded that winter. The criminal fraud charges related to the certification forgery resulted in the suspension of his water claims across the valley, and the territorial court's review of the 1849 Community Resource Designation permanently removed the legal basis for any private water rights claim over the shared creek system. 3 of the smaller ranch families who had sold under pressure in the previous 4 years filed for the return of their properties, citing fraud as the condition of their transactions. 2 of those cases succeeded. The valley that Hale had spent 4 years trying to consolidate under his control remained stubbornly and permanently a collection of independent operations owned by families who had decided they were not leaving. Whitaker Ridge was among the most stable of them. Abigail ran the ranch accounts with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this work her entire life without being credited for it, and now had a context in which the credit was simply reality, unremarkable, and consistent, like weather. The grain supplier contract was renegotiated again in the spring, to even better terms, after Abigail spent a week comparing prices from 3 competing suppliers and presented Caleb with a document that saved the ranch approximately 9% on annual feed costs. He read the document and looked at her and said, "I don't know how I ran this place before you." And she said, "Inefficiently." And he laughed, and it was the sound of a man who had not laughed enough in 6 years and was making up for it. She started the women's management program that spring. It was not a formal thing. Not initially. It began as Cora Sims sitting at Abigail's kitchen table once a week to go through the Sims ranch accounts together, which became Cora and the eldest Rhea's daughter, and a woman named Pearl, who'd inherited her late brother's small operation and had no idea how to read a land survey, which became a regular gathering every second Tuesday of 6 and then 8 and then 11 women from across the valley, learning the specific practical knowledge that Abigail had accumulated over a lifetime of doing useful things in rooms where nobody gave her credit for them. She taught them accounting. She taught them water rights law, what she'd learned from the Hale case. She taught them how to read a survey document and how to file a legal claim and how to build a coalition with your neighbors when a powerful man tried to convince you that you were facing something alone. She taught them without ever making a speech about it, that the practical knowledge of how to run and protect something was not complicated. It was just information, and information belonged to anyone willing to learn it. "You should charge for this," Cora told her one Tuesday evening as the last women were leaving. "I know," Abigail said. "I'm thinking about it." "Do more than think," Cora said. "This valley needs this, permanently." She was right. By the following year, the Whitaker Ridge Women's Land and Management Program, which is what Abigail eventually called it in the practical descriptive way she named. Most things had a formal structure, a small fee that covered materials, and a modest stipend for Abigail's time, and a waiting list of women from 3 counties who'd heard about it through the particular reliable channel of women who have found something useful telling other women about it. Roy turned 20 and proposed to the McAllister girl and was accepted, which pleased everyone at the ranch to a degree that surprised him. Darnell, who had planned to retire, decided instead that he wanted to train horses, which turned out to be something he was extraordinarily good at, and which Caleb formalized into a training operation that became its own source of income for the ranch within 18 months. Loretta did not retire at 6 months. She retired at 14 months on her own schedule, having determined that the kitchen was now in sufficiently capable hands. She came back for every Tuesday gathering and sat at the end of the table and drank coffee, and occasionally offered opinions that were always worth hearing. On a late summer evening, 1 year and 3 months after Abigail had climbed down from old Pete's wagon with her one battered suitcase and her mother's Bible, she stood on the hill above Whitaker Ridge and looked at what the land had become. Not what it looked like. She was not a woman who dwelt on appearances. What it was: a working ranch thriving, a legal legacy that had protected a dozen families from a man who'd tried to take everything they had. A room full of women on Tuesday evenings who were learning that their names belonged on land documents and legal filings and account books alongside any man's name, and that the knowledge to put them there was available to anyone willing to sit down and learn it. She heard Caleb's boots on the grass behind her and felt him settle beside her the way he always settled beside her, close enough to be present, steady enough to be relied on, leaving her exactly the space she needed. "Darnell says the South herd gained 12 pounds average since the new feed rotation," he said. "I know," she said. "I wrote the feed rotation." "I know you did." He was quiet for a moment. "Roy asked me today if I thought he was ready to take on the yearling training independently." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to ask you," Caleb said. "You know his work better than I do." She smiled at the horizon. A year ago, she would not have known how to receive the simple matter-of-fact handing of authority to her without ceremony or condition, as though it were the obvious thing. She was learning. She was still learning how to live in a context where what she was capable of was the thing that mattered, where her value was not in question every morning when she opened her eyes. She suspected she would be learning it for years, and she found she didn't mind. Learning was something she was good at. "He's ready," she said. "Tell him I said so." "I will." Caleb's hand found hers in the evening quiet, and she held it the way she'd learned to hold things that were worth keeping firmly without performance, with the simple, honest grip of a woman who knew her own strength and was no longer afraid of it. She thought about the wagon ride, the single suitcase, her father's laughter still ringing in her ears as she'd come down from that seat and stood in the yard of a ranch that belonged to a stranger and wondered what came next. She thought about the girl she'd been then, not weak, never weak, but unconfirmed. A woman who had known her own worth in theory and had not yet had the ground on which to prove it. She had the ground now. She had built it herself with these hands in this valley among these people who had chosen her the way she had chosen them, not by accident or obligation, or the accident of blood, but by the daily decision to stay and build and show up and do the work. "Caleb," she said. "The people who threw me away," she said. "I don't think about them much anymore." He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was listening with his full attention. "I used to think about them every day," she said. "What they thought of me. Whether they were right. Whether I'd ever be able to prove they were wrong." She looked out at the ranch below them, at the lights coming on in the windows, at Loretta's lamp in the kitchen, and Roy crossing the yard with his easy young stride, and the cattle in the far pasture moving with the unhurried certainty of animals in a place they belonged. "I don't need to prove it anymore. It's just true. It was always true." Caleb's hand tightened on hers once briefly. "Yeah," he said. It was. The evening settled around them, warm and wide, and full of the particular quiet of a place that has been fought for and held. And Abigail Boone. Abigail Whitaker stood on the hill above the ranch that was hers, beside the man who had chosen her in the life she had built, from the ruins of being thrown away. And she felt in the deepest and most permanent part of herself something she had been working toward her entire life. Not rescued, not redeemed, not transformed. Simply at last and without apology home.